Okay, so then is it the case then that, and this is part of the expression of political variability in opinion that you hear expressed in the United States right now? It was definitely the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that after the Soviet wall fell, that the West did take steps quite rapidly to try to consolidate some of the border territories between the former Soviet Union and the West, and to invite the Baltic states and so forth into a much closer partnership with the West. And a lot of that happened quite quickly. And then Ukraine was sort of left in an in-between state for a long time. So it didn't get moved west as fast as some of the other states did.
Yeah, I'd like to clean up the history here, because I think that the details matter. So the Soviet Union formally ends at the end of 1991. There is discussion about exactly what's going to happen to Germany and about whether East Germany is going to become a part of NATO, and the Russians have a certain idea of what they were told, and we have a different idea of what they were told. There were no formal commitments one way or another, but it ended with Germany being reunited and then all of Germany remaining in NATO. There was no further expansion of NATO until 1997. Okay, so that's very important. It is not like in 1990, it's not like the year after the Soviet Union fell, NATO expanded. Nor is it the case that the messages that were going from the West to Russia were, we're going to take all of the non-Russia parts of the former Soviet Union into NATO, but you Russians need to stay out. You're the adversary. On the contrary, NATO reached out to Russia also, and NATO established a Partnership for Peace program. And Russia was a member of the Partnership for Peace program, along with all of the other former Soviet states. And NATO did offer various forms of technical assistance. The US offered various forms of technical assistance to Russia in the 1990s, most of which the Russians rejected, some of which they accepted, which were very important. And there was a lot of cooperation, because it's important to note that when Boris Yeltsin was president, he did not identify the West as the enemy. He sought to integrate into the West. He sought to westernize Russia, and he did to a considerable extent. And he sought to democratize Russia, and he did. And he had to fight off multiple efforts by the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union to regain power and reestablish communist rule. And he fought against that, and we did try to help him with that. But the first NATO expansion doesn't happen until 1997, and it did not include the Baltic states. The Baltic states were admitted in, I think, 2003, 2004. I've forgotten the exact date in there, but they were not admitted in that first tranche. So the notion that we somehow just immediately started snapping up, former Warsaw Pact states and then Baltic states into the alliance is false. Nor is it the case that that was initially done in a way, in the way that we expressed it to the Russians, as being aimed at threatening Russia. These states sought admission into the alliance. And look, we've got to recognize that the alliance was formed on a principle of an open door policy that is inherent, that is innate in the North Atlantic Charter that founded the alliance, that any state can request admission to the alliance. This is one of the things that Putin is demanding that NATO change. But that provision was not added or created after the end of the Cold War. It was created when the alliance was created. Now, obviously, the alliance doesn't have to choose to admit any particular member, but we can now ask another question, which is what did we, the West, think that NATO was doing in the 90s? And why were we admitting these former Warsaw Pact and then the Baltic states to the alliance? Yes, we wanted to make sure that we had a buffer against the kind of threat that the Soviets had brought into Central Europe, because it's important to keep in mind that the Cold War was shaped by the fact that whereas we, the United States and Britain, and then a restored France, as we liberated territories, we made them free. And we offered them the opportunity to join NATO. They did join NATO, and which became a very rambunctious alliance, which periodically told the United States to pound sand, and which we did not run as an empire, Soviet rhetoric notwithstanding. And it was an alliance of free states. And it is a purely defensive alliance. There's absolutely no offensive provision in the NATO charter anywhere. So that's what we did. What did the Soviets do? Well, when the Red Army rolled into Eastern Europe, it did not liberate anybody. It drove off the German forces, and then it took control of those countries, installed puppet states, which were ruled from Moscow. How do we know that? Because there were periodic revolutions in the Eastern European states, which the United States and NATO did not foment and did not support, and which the Soviets crushed brutally with tanks repeatedly. So they established an empire in Eastern Europe, and they brought millions of forces into the heart of Europe and threatened to overrun all of Western Europe. And that was the threat against which NATO was formed. I tell you all of that to say that people talk about the buffer that the Russians feel that they need against the West. The NATO expansion was about giving the West a buffer from the threat that it had just managed to drive off of vast Soviet mechanized armies in the heart of Europe, poised to overrun all of the West. So there was absolutely a security thing. NATO is a security alliance, and the big part of this was gaining a buffer for the West so that Europe could actually have peace and develop peacefully and without fear, which the threat of Soviet invasion throughout the Cold War had denied it. But in addition to that, the NATO accession was also meant to help bring those Warsaw Pact states and then the Baltic states into compliance with NATO standards, which is not just about military stuff. It's also about legal, moral, ethical frameworks, that about how we fight wars, about how we treat our soldiers, about how the military interacts with the civilian population. It was meant to be part of an effort that was successful to help those countries develop healthy democracies and healthy free market economies. And we invested...
And the capacity for some autonomous function at the national level, or for full autonomous function at the national level.
Right, complete,
Right,
because
so-
we don't control them, right.
So you're laying out an argument essentially that claims that to view this as a duopoly, let's say it's the US and its satellites against Russia and its satellites, that's a profound misapprehension of the historical reality, because it wasn't Russia and its satellites, it was the Soviet Union, which was a bloc, and it's America with its allies. So America sits as first among equals, let's say, something like that, in a voluntary organization that's predicated on the preservation of freedom at the political level and at the economic level. And if we want evidence for that, we look at the response of the wall in Berlin, for example, to take not the least of the examples, but the crushing of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and almost Poland when the Soviet Union did fall, and look at the response to any manifestation of genuine autonomy on the part of the Soviets.